Okay, you'll notice that I start this off with CIA-initiated remote viewing program. That's because when the program began, it was initiated with the CIA, but very soon, and for reasons I'll give you details on, after a very short period, it turned out the CIA had to get out of the program, and then we ended up getting transferred elsewhere. And most of the program was actually under DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency. So that's why I'm emphasizing CIA initiated, but by and large, it was actually a DIA program.
Mhm.
Okay, historically, it was a top secret special access program. SAP means that you had to be on a list, and here are the names of the programs along the way: Gondola Wish, Sunstreak, and so on, eventually being called Stargate. And if your name wasn't on that list to get access to, let's say, Stargate, then it didn't matter that you had top secret clearances. You simply could not get access. So that's what we mean by being a special access program. At present, some of it's still classified, but there's significant archives that recently released from the CIA. It's available on the internet, so it's you can get details. Now, before 1995, the mantra was from the government, when in doubt, keep it classified. However, in April of 95, President Clinton issued an executive order in which he said, if there is sufficient doubt about the need to classify a program or information, it shall not be classified. So the remote viewing program started its declassification in July of 1995. And so at that point, at that point, it was the first time I could say CIA, SRI, RV in a single sentence in public and not go to jail. Now, maybe one of the most paranormal things is, well, how did it ever get started at a place like SRI? SRI was Stanford Research Institute, originally connected with Stanford University, did lots of work for the government and for various corporations and so on. Our program was mounted in this building where my cursor is, called the Radio Physics Laboratory. And in fact, we were so highly classified right from the beginning that we were housed in this unit on top of the building without windows. So it was difficult to get up into our area. So how did that start? Well, actually, I'm a physicist. I wouldn't expect to be involved in this area. I had just recently co-authored a textbook, Fundamentals of Quantum Electronics at Stanford. And the book was published in English, French, Russian, and Chinese. And the thing is, there's nothing like writing a book about physics and realizing how much you don't know. So a big question was, okay, well, what about consciousness? What about even grass growing in the field? Any biological function? Is it all still just atoms and molecules all the way down? It just gets too complicated to analyze? Or might there be some other additional fields besides those that we have in our physics repertoire? So it turned out about that time, purely by a lark, I happened to run across some work done by a fellow, Cleve Baxter, in New York City, who was a polygraph expert. He ran polygraphs on CIA agents and FBI people and so on. And one day, just on a lark, he happened to connect his polygraph up to a plant. And he was amazed to find out that the plant had signals coming out of it that were very similar to what he sees with people. And as with a person, he decided that he was going to threaten the plant. And when he did, he got a big response. So he thought to himself, oh my God, maybe that means that there's some sentience associated with plants. And so he set up a couple of plants side by side. And he found if he did something to one plant and it made a response, the other plant would show a response as if they were coupled. So I thought, well, that sounds interesting. Maybe the fields associated with however these plants are, quote, talking to each other, maybe these are some new additional fields that we should take into account in physics. So I decided to do what for me was a pure physics experiment, set up an algae culture, separate it into two halves, place one half of the culture at a remote laser link site several miles away, and then I would zap the local culture with a laser and see if I got a response at the second site. And if I did, I'd be able to measure the speed of propagation of the signal, and I might learn something about that. So I sent that off to Cleve Baxter, the polygraph expert, and said, well, what do you think about my copying your experiment, except instead of using plants, I'm going to use algae cultures, and I'm going to make it really high tech with some laser involvement and so on. He thought it was a good idea. So this is one of those times in life when your life takes a left-hand turn by pure circumstance. It turned out that there was a cocktail party in New York City, and Cleve Baxter, shown here on the right, the polygraph expert, went to the cocktail party, and while there, he ran into Ingo Swann, who we now all know is basically the father of remote viewing. And so they started talking about, well, what do you do for a living and so on. And Cleve told him about the experiments in his lab with plants. And so Ingo said, well, can I come over and see if the plants respond to me? So he invited Ingo over, and they did some experiments that had some interesting outcomes. Meanwhile, while Ingo was at Cleve's lab, he saw my proposal. And so he sent me a letter and said, look, if you're interested in sort of the borderline between animate and inanimate physics, why work with algae cultures? They can't tell you anything. You should work with somebody like me, and I could tell you what's going on. Now, ordinarily, as a physicist, I would have thought that was interesting, and I would have thrown it in the trash can. However, attached to the letter, he had a report that was generated by Professor Gertrude Schmeidler at City College in New York, where she had done some experiments with him, where they had very sensitive temperature measuring devices across on the other side of the laboratory, and on command, he would, from a distance, make the temperatures go up and down on those instruments. So when I saw that, I thought, well, that sounds like physics. So I decided to invite him out to Stanford and see what he could do. As you may know, Ingo's actually quite well known for his artistic work. Some of his paintings have even hung inside major museums in Washington, D.C. In fact, the painting you see behind me is one of Ingo's paintings that he actually painted while he was visiting and staying in our house out in Menlo Park, California for a while. Well, anyway, based on that experiment, I decided to invite him out to Stanford, and I started talking to my physics friends, and they said, oh my God, these guys are all frauds and charlatans. You better really have something good. So anyway, I did invite him out. And that's us in 1972. And I did have something good. We had a magnetometer. That's a very sensitive magnetic field measuring device. It's actually a quantum chip. And that quantum chip was down inside of a very well-shielded environment. It had electrical shielding, it had magnetic shielding, it was acoustically isolated, and in fact, it even had superconducting shielding, which is the best electromagnetic shield we know of. And so the idea was that nothing could affect that quantum chip down inside from the outside. So they were able to use it to look for quarks uh, that might show up inside the device. So I took him over there and I said, "Oh, you remember that experiment you did with Gertrude Schmeidler where you made the temperature go up and down? Well, this is sort of an experiment like that on steroids. I mean, down inside this shielded environment, including a superconducting shield, we have a very sensitive quantum chip, but it's so well shielded from the environment that should be no way to affect it from the outside. So we just wanted to see if you could repeat the experiment like you did in Gertrude Schmeidler's lab." And so ordinarily, what you see coming out on a strip chart recorder is a very slow moving, about 30 seconds for one of these waves to record. And so he said, "Okay, well, I'll concentrate on it." And lo and behold, it changed. And the poor graduate students whose life depended on this not being perturbable from the outside said, "Oh, wait a minute, maybe there's some bubbles in the helium line or something." And so he took a little bit of time to try to figure out, uh, what artifact might be present, so on. He said, "Okay, I'm sure that was just a glitch. It just was kind of happened to happen right when you were going to try to affect it, but I bet you can't do it again." And so Ingo concentrated on it and he did it again. So he said, "Okay, well, please get out of my lab. Go have a snack or something. I got to find out what's wrong with my instrument." So for a good half hour or so, he continued to run and it ran just fine. We came back into the lab and he said, "Well, I'm sure you can't make that happen again." And sure enough, Ingo did. And these are major, major effects, not anything that happens, by chance. And so, in fact, at that point, of course, he kicked us out of the lab and took data for hours, and there was no similar glitch. Now, the thing that was interesting was that when I asked him, "Well, how'd you know what to do?" What he said was, "Well, I just looked inside to see how it was all set up inside." And then he made a little drawing and gave a description of what he saw inside. That is, he remote viewed through all the shielding to give a description of how it was all laid out inside, which was amazing because, in fact, he generated a very good description. This had never been published anywhere, so there's no way he could have gotten information about how it was laid out in there. So anyway, that was absolutely an amazing kind of situation. So anyway, I circulated around a report about that, and suddenly the CIA descended on my doorstep and said, "Oh, have we been looking for you?" And so I said, "Well, why? What did I do?" Well, they said, "We looked into your background. We saw that after your master's degree, you ended up being a naval intelligence officer stationed at NSA, the National Security Agency, with lots of high clearances, and that eventually you got your PhD and then came to work at SRI." And so we realized that we had a problem. And they plopped a book down on my desk about the size of a telephone book from the Defense Intelligence Agency, which stated that indeed the Russians had been spending millions of dollars for over a decade researching ESP phenomena, and they didn't know how to evaluate if this was some kind of threat because by and large, no scientist in America even believed there was such a thing as ESP. But you did this experiment with Ingo Swann. And the thing that was most interesting to us was not the fact that he apparently was able to perturb it, but the fact that he could apparently, quote, see inside and make a drawing of how it was laid out inside. Well, I mean, if that's really true, what that could mean is that even if we hide our most secret documents inside of superconducting shielded safes, they may not be, they may still be able to be seen by people with this kind of a talent. So anyway, would you be willing to set up an experiment and see, what he could do? And we'll tell you right out from the beginning, we're hoping you'll find this is all nonsense, that was just some kind of coincidental effects, and then we can take this off our plate and not worry about it anymore. So I don't know, for 50,000 bucks, so on. I said, yeah, we'll have a little project on this and let you know what we find. Meanwhile, I went on with my laser work, but nonetheless, we sort of did this on the side. And since they were interested in this, quote, remote viewing aspect, they had us do various kinds of experiments. Here's an example, one sample among 1,000. Some foreign country was using an abacus as a way of encrypting messages. And so they had us show up in a hotel room with this device in a suitcase and have Ingo come to the hotel to a different room and ask him to look into our room and describe what was inside our room. And he gave a reasonable description of this abacus. He said it was a sort of a game box with little balls. Not a bad description. But of course, that really concerned the CIA people because they were hoping that we would find this is all nonsense and they could forget about it. But nonetheless, that's the kind of result we started getting. Well, after doing lots of experiments like that, Ingo said, I'm bored with this. You put things in the laboratory, in the next room or whatever, you're trivializing my ability. I can see anywhere in the planet. We said, oh my God, can't believe that. And so he threatened to quit. And so he said, okay, well, tell me what you have in mind. He says, well, just, send people out into the San Francisco Bay Area and I'll describe where they are. Well, it's only because of his threat to quit that we decided to do that experiment because I thought, this is crazy. This couldn't possibly work. So to give an example, one of the very first ones we did, we had our management put together a list of 100 sites that were within a half hour of SRI, and they would pull one out at random and give it to me, and I would drive out to the site wherever it was, and then back in the lab, Ingo would have to describe where I was. So here's an example where it turned out that the Palo Alto central office was a few miles away. And so he said, well, where Hal is standing, off to the right, there are 4 trees. In fact, there were 4 trees. Said there's a very fancy kind of sidewalk around them. He tried to draw that. And interesting enough, he said, and I get the feeling like there's a fountain there, but I don't hear the water running. Well, it turned out the day that we were out at the site, in fact, the fountain was turned off. And then he described the building as having pillars and so on. So that was pretty amazing. So I had to report that back. So this is how remote viewing got started. Our definition is direct awareness or experience of distant locations or events in space and time. I'll get to the time part later. That are blocked from ordinary perception by distance, shielding, or time, and generally considered to be secure from such access by any known physical means or by means of logical inference. So that's how remote viewing got started. Now, quite soon, we got a little bit of newspaper coverage of the fact we had this ESP experiment going on at SRI. And so we got a contact from this fellow in the center. His name is Pat Price, who used to be police commissioner at Burbank, California. And he said, I saw your some stuff in the newspaper about your experiments there. He said, when I was a police commissioner in Burbank, sometimes when we were tracking down a thief or whatever, I would suddenly get these images of where he was, and it turned out that they were correct. So I thought I'd volunteer for your experiments. So anyway, I invited him up to SRI, and turned out he was really an excellent remote viewer. Of course, our CIA contract monitor, you can always pick them out. They wear the dark glasses. The reason I'm standing in front of a glider is we did a series of experiments where Pat would go up in the glider. The CIA guy would draw something on a piece of paper on the ground, and he'd reproduce it. And then the CIA guy would go up in the glider, and he'd be on the ground. And the CIA guy would draw something while he's in the glider, and Pat would reproduce it. So it turned out that was a series of very effective experiments. Of course, at that time, they called us the Plaid Pants Trio. But anyway, to give you an idea about what can be right, but also what can be wrong with remote viewing, this is one of the first ones we did with Pat Price. Turned out to be an excellent remote viewer. In this case, the target randomly selected was a swimming pool complex. And this was Pat's drawing and discussion of what he was seeing. And he said, well, first of all, I see a pool of water. It's about 60 by 89 feet. It was really 75 by 100. And then I see a circular pool of water about 120 feet in diameter. It's really 110 feet in diameter. He gave an almost perfect description of this pool house. But what's really the most interesting aspect of this is what's wrong with it. First of all, you notice that there's a left-right reversal. The circular pool is on the right of the rectangular pool, not as he's drawn it. And we began to see those reversals a lot, and have some ideas why that might occur. But when we asked him what kind of location this was, he said, well, I think it's a water purification plant. And he drew machinery in the center of the pools, which came strictly out of his imagination. There were no such. And then in addition, he said, saw a couple of tanks of water that in fact weren't there. So he had this peculiar aspect that we got description of two pools of water and a pool house that were actually amazingly accurate, except he had this left-right reversal, and then he misidentified what the purpose of it was, and he threw in some things that just simply weren't there. So that's the kind of thing we began to see occurring in remote viewing. That is, getting good shapes and layouts, often with a left-right reversal, but getting incorrect interpretations of what was being observed, and things showing up that just came out of imagination, like these two tanks of water. Well, about this time, we got to the point where we had 6 remote viewers, all of whom were doing quite well. And so the CIA said, we'll find out what it is about these people so that we might be able to recruit some people within CIA that have similar potential abilities. So we did a medical profile that was very thorough, even got down to 7-layer brain scans. And the doctors came back and said, well, everything we measure about these people, they're just ordinary. There's nothing special about them. Oh, okay. So I thought, okay, well, maybe it's their neuropsychological profile or something. So we ran them through all kinds of neuropsychological profile tests and psychological profile tests. And we got to the point where we knew as much about our remote viewers as NASA knew about its astronauts. And again, they came back and said, well, there's nothing particularly outstanding about these people. They're coming up in the middle of the curve like normal people. So that was a bit of a kind of a surprise for us. So I thought, well, maybe that means that, normal people who never thought about this might be able to do it. Well, it turned out about that time we had we knew someone who was at SRI in some other experiments, nothing to do with our investigation, Hella Hammond. And we said, Hella, would you be willing to do some experiments with us in addition to what else you're doing here at SRI? And she said, okay, well, sure. What kind of experiments? No, we said they're like ESP experiments. And she just basically said, "Oh, you got to be kidding! I've never had an ESP experience." So we said, "Okay, but it'll be fun. So why don't you give it a try?" So anyway, she agreed to give it a try. And so what we did with her to start were a copy of some experiments we actually did with Ingo Swann when the CIA people were visiting, because they spent some time putting things in a box, and then he'd come into the lab and describe what was in the box. Those experiments worked really quite well. So we decided to do those kind of experiments with Hella Hammond. And so we had small metal film cans, and we put something in the film cans, and then she would come into the lab, and her job was to describe what was inside the film cans. So in this case, there was a spool and a needle inside the film can, and she basically described the cross section of a spool and showed a pin. Then we put a curled up leaf inside, and she said, well, there's something all kind of curled up inside. Then we put a leather belt key ring inside, and she said, well, this is peculiar. I'm getting a belt, and I know a belt can't fit inside a film can, but that's what I'm getting. And she made this drawing, which is actually not bad. One time we just filled it with sand, and so she drew if the sand could be hardened and the film can taken away, that's basically what you would see. And so here she was reproducing what was hidden inside of film cans, and she'd never had an ESP experience in her life. She was amazed at this. So we decided to go ahead and try her on some of these outside uh, experiments. Now, let's just give you an example. I was sent by a random protocol to this pedestrian overpass target. And she said, well, I see Hal out there. Where he's standing, it kind of looks like this. And she made a drawing. Not too bad. She said, there's something fast going by, but I can't tell what it is. Well, this is an overpass over a freeway, and there were cars going by underneath, but she couldn't tell that they were cars. And she said it's sort of like some kind of diagonal trough up in the air, but it's got holes in it, so it couldn't carry water. Well, in fact, that's exactly right for this pedestrian overpass. So once again, um, we saw this apparent aspect of remote viewing, which is you sort of get the shapes and so on, but you can't interpret what the significance is of what you're seeing. And so that's a process we found all the time. So anyway, out of this series of meetings with her, experiments with her and with other people, we realized, okay, there appears to be a Bell distribution of talent, as with a musical ability or um, sports ability or whatever. You just sort of have a bell curve of talent where maybe at one end of the scale you've got superstars, and at the other end of the scale you've got duds. But this implied that chances are that someone off the street has a fair chance of falling somewhere in the bell curve and can do remote viewing even if they never thought about it before. We also recognize that there appeared to be what we call right brain pattern recognition functioning as opposed to left brain analytical interpretive functioning. That is, people could make drawings to represent what it is they're seeing, but they were often off when they tried to interpret what it was they were seeing. So we develop our strategies, which is, okay, tell us what you see, not what you think it is. That was a critical factor. And by following that procedure, that tended to separate the raw data input from what we call analytical overlay, thus increasing the signal to noise ratio. So the main thing here was not trying to make remote viewing better, but trying to keep analysis out of the way so that people could do it and not basically go off the track by trying to interpret what it is they were seeing. Well, about this time, we started running into our first set of problems. We had psychologists and other programs at SRI saying, you've got to get rid of that ESP program. It's hurting SRI's reputation. Of course, they didn't know we were doing it for the CIA or anything like that. But and so I remember our office management said, well, what's the problem? What do you think might be wrong with these experiments? And so they said, okay, well, subjects will say grass is green, sky is blue, and the experimentals get all excited, but that doesn't mean anything. So our management said, okay, well, how would you try to find out if, in fact, that's all that's going on? And he said, well, just give us a list of targets and a list of transcripts, have them all misnumbered, and we'll try to match the targets against the transcripts, or transcripts against the targets, and it'll just come out at random. So I said, okay. So we took the first 9 that we had done with Pat Price. They're the targets. And the transcripts were randomly numbered. And so our critics would go out to the first target, say Hoover Tower, and try to do a matching with the transcripts, not knowing which one was actually generated. So say, okay, well, transcript 5 is the best match. Transcript 1 is the second best match. Transcript 2 is the third best match, but the rest of them are sort of don't match. Okay, fine. Go out to the next one and do the same thing again. Say, okay, well, transcript 3 is best match, transcript 8 is second best match, and so on. Anyway, make a long story short, they actually went nuts when they found out the result, which was they had 7 first place matches out of the 9 in this random matching procedure. So that got them off our tail because they finally realized that, well, maybe there is something to this. We also had problems when we went to brief this at CIA headquarters. I remember we were in the CIA briefing room. Actually, it was the briefing room where the Bad Pigs invasion had been planned. And we had, I don't know, 10 or 15 people in there, and we were going through our data. And one of the people in the room said, "Hey, hold it. I know what this is. This is a psych test of our gullibility. And whoever's taking notes, I want you to know I'm not buying it." And he stormed out of the room. Nonetheless, we went on with the rest of our presentation, and it went over really quite well. But the problems didn't end there. Suddenly, one of the people came from CIA and said, "My name is so and so, but you can call me Fraud Buster. I'm here to see what the scam is." I said, "Okay, fine." Says, "Okay, well, bring in one of your remote viewers and let me see a remote viewing experiment." So the way we had it set up is my colleague Russ Targ would be in the room with the remote viewer and with our fraud buster guy watching the whole process. I would be sent by a random protocol to some place in the San Francisco Bay Area. Well, it turned out on the first experiment we did with him, watching, uh, our remote viewer gave a really good description of where I was. So we took him out to the site, and he could see that it matched really well. And so we were all excited, and he said, "Oh, no, no, no. You probably found some way to tell him in advance where you're going to go or whatever. So let's do another experiment. Only this time, I'm going to pick where we go. We're not going to use uh, one of your selections." So he said, "Okay, that's fine." So he got in the car and he would turn left or right at each stop sign or traffic light, depending on whether the number in the car in front of him had a license plate that was even or odd. And so we ended up someplace, and it turned out our remote viewer gave an excellent description. And so he decided, okay, now wait a minute. Now maybe you had somebody follow us and tell them where we went. So let's do another experiment. We're going to go in my car, not your car, because maybe you had a radio inside the car and he heard us talking about where we were. So anyway, he did experiment number 3. In his car, he picked the site. We're supposed to be at our site for 30 minutes. After 15 minutes, he says, "Okay, jump in the car. We're going to go to another site." We said, "Well, wait a minute. Experiment's not over." He said, "That's okay. You may have had somebody follow us out to see where we were going." Well, anyway, our good remote viewer described both sites. He said, "We're only halfway through the experiment, but they're getting in the car already and going to a different site." So anyway, he had to admit that this looked pretty intriguing. He says, I'm going to think about this overnight. I'm sure I'll be able to figure out how you're scamming me." So Russ and I got together and said, "Okay, well, we got a hard case here. Maybe we should take advantage of our bell curve. Let's make him do the remote viewing. And if we get a good result, he'll know we didn't scam him because he will have gotten the result." So the next day he comes in, he says, "Okay, well, where's the remote viewer?" And we say, "Well, today you're the remote viewer." He says, "You got to be kidding. I don't believe in this stuff." He said, "Well, look, at least you'll be able to report back that we're not stressing the people out and all that kind of stuff." So I said, "Okay, I agree." So we did another remote viewing with him as the remote viewer. I would say make sure. Russ said, "Okay, close your eyes. Tell me what you see with regard to where Hal is." And he says, "When my eyes are closed, I see the back of my eyelids. It's dark." He said, "Well, you got to use your imagination. I mean, this is a mental thing." He said, "Oh, yeah, I got a great imagination. I see him at a bridge over a stream, but that's just my imagination." Well, it turned out I was at a bridge over a stream. We take him out to the site. He sees us exactly as he described it, basically. So we're absolutely ecstatic. We said, "Okay, well, we've solved this." And as we're coming back, he says, "I think I know how you scammed me." We said, "Well, what do you mean? You did it." You're the one that did this. And he said, well, let's do another experiment. I don't want anybody in the room interviewing me. Let's just do another experiment. Okay, fine. So I left him in the room by himself. We taped the door shut so he couldn't get out. We didn't trust him anymore, and he trusted us. We go out to one of our sites. We come back. It turned out that our site, in this case, turned out to be this sort of merry-go-round where kids are playing. And he drew something that had, these sort of pie-shaped sections of different colors, which did match. He had arches, and of course, we do have arches. And even though his interpretation that there's some kind of a cupola was incorrect, but that's analytical overlay, but his physical description was actually quite good. So he finally agreed, well, it looks like maybe this stuff really does work. So anyway, we said, well, we noticed when we came back into the room that he was sitting in the corner of the room with his hands over his ears. We said, well, why are you sitting in the corner of the room? And why didn't you want somebody with you, interviewing you? And he said, well, one of my hypotheses was that the person who was interviewing me knew what the site was, and they were using subtle body language cues to get me to put down the right answer. So that's why I didn't want anybody with me. And then I sat in the corner of the room. I didn't want to sit in that cushy chair because I figured you had speakers in the cushions of the chair subliminally whispering a description of the site to me. And so that's why I didn't sit in the chair. So, gosh, it looks like this stuff really worked. Well, it turned out he went on to become one of our great CIA remote viewers. Well, about that time, we had another problem, which was the only thing secret about the program was that it was secret. So, in fact, people were saying, wow, they're doing these fancy ESP experiments, not publishing anything. Well, maybe it's a secret program. So I had to go back to the CIA people and say, look, you got to let us publish something because people are figuring out this is a secret program. That's the only thing that's secret. So they said, okay. So we gathered up the data that we had to that point, which is about 54 experiments. When you see visitor 1, visitor 2, visitor 3, those are all CIA agents that we got to do experiments. And overall, all but one of the experiments was statistically significant. So we wrote it all up, sent it off to the proceedings of the IEEE, Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, because Russ and I were well known there. We had published there on technical electronics issues. So we figured we'd have a pretty good chance of getting it published there. And we got a message back from the editor of the journal, who was head of Bell Labs communications. And he said, well, I don't know if I should publish this or not. And I said, why? Are you getting bad reviews? He said, no, actually, I'm getting good reviews, but I got one bad review where the guy simply wrote down, I wouldn't believe in this even if it were true. So anyway, he said, okay, since that person was a high roller in the engineering field, he felt he didn't really want to go against him. So he said, look, let us come to Bell Labs. We'll present all of our results to your engineers. If they throw tomatoes, okay, don't publish our paper. But if they like what we're saying, publish our paper. He said, okay, that sounds good. So we went. We got a very good reception. The engineers are trying to figure out how it could possibly happen with some kind of electromagnetic brainwave signals being sent around and so on. He was still nervous about publishing it. We said, okay. So we decided to pull our best card and say, look, you set up experiments here at Bell Labs. You pick your own people to be remote viewers. You pick your own people to pick the targets. You pick your own people to blind judge the results. And if you get the kind of results we're getting, then publish our paper. He said, okay, that's fair enough. He got terrifically good results. And so, in fact, our paper did get published. Perceptual channel for information transfer over kilometer distances so on. So that was our first major lengthy publication. 1976, Proceedings of the IEEE. Well, about that time, we had another problem with Ingo Swann, who was our major remote viewer. He said, this is boring. If you want to know what a site looks like that's within a half-hour drive of SRI, go look at it. You don't need me for that. I can see anywhere in the world. Well, that sounded pretty ridiculous. So we actually refused to do that experiment. And so finally he said, well, I'm quitting. So he said, oh, okay, well, we can't send people around the world. And he said, well, no, I said, it's okay. Just give me the coordinates and I'll describe what's there. We said, give you the coordinates. I mean, coordinates are made up, man-made numbers. What does that have to do with the site? He said, well, look, we're trying to look at a physical location that has coordinates, but this is all a mental kind of thing. Well, coordinates are kind of a mental construction, so it looks like that would be a good connection. I said, okay. I'll just give you one example. We did many. It was Kerguelen Island in South Indian Ocean. It actually looks as you see up here. He drew his map. What was most interesting was he gave a lot of detail about stuff on the island that were not generally known. Only the CIA knew about aspects about what was on the island. So when they saw these results, they thought that was absolutely amazing. So finally, our CIA contract monitor said, well, they're still talking about, maybe memorizes the globe or something. So let us send somebody out to a site and let your remote viewer describe where we are. So anyway, somebody at CIA chose actually a vacation cabin of theirs that was out in West Virginia. What the fellow didn't realize was that right over the ridge was this really super secret NSA facility. And so both remote viewers, Ingo Swann and Pat Price, when they were said, we want you to locate a site and, we'll give you coordinates. They both come up with, well, it doesn't look like there's much here, just kind of a cabin sitting here. But right over the ridge is this really sexy site. It's full of antennas and stuff. Maybe that's it. So Ingo drew a very detailed drawing, which turned out to be quite a good match to the site. It turned out that the site was an NSA facility for intercepting communications from Soviet satellites. When we targeted Pat Price on the site, he said it was really a sexy, high-tech site. And so he decided to wander around the site and he saw a safe. And so he, as he describes it, mushed his head into the safe and a bunch of words popped into his mind. So he gave us a bunch of words. Well, it turned out those words were project titles, highly classified. And so eventually, a couple decades later, you can get access to CIA's evaluation of that experiment. See, Pat Price, who had no military or intelligence background, provided a list of project titles associated with current and past activities, including one of extreme sensitivity. Also, the code name of the site was provided. Well, as you can imagine, when that actually happened, the entire law enforcement apparatus of our country descended on us and said, how'd you get this data? You must have a mole inside that site. The only thing that saved us from not going to jail or something was the fact that one of the people at CIA said, okay, well, let's think about this. We briefed the mid-level manager, Office of Technical Services. It was about time to renew the project, by the way. And he said, I'm not going to renew this project. And we said, well, why not? And he said, well, I've learned that if you have a weird project, 99% of the time there's something wrong with it and you just say no. But anyway, we went over his head and we briefed his boss, who is a very infamous director of MK Ultra. Anyway, he said, yes, we'll continue with the project. Don't worry, my mid-level managers are always risk averse, so don't worry about it. We'll do it. Meanwhile, he got booted out of CIA for a lot of other things he was doing. He got replaced by John McMahon, who eventually became, I think, director of CIA, or at least deputy director. And he said, okay, I'll renew the project, but don't waste it on our sites. Try a Soviet site. So he gave us the coordinates of some R&D facility in the middle of Russia at Semipalatinsk and said, see if your remote viewers can describe what's at these coordinates. So I said, okay. Pat Price was our remote viewer. He gave a layout of the site, and it was really challenging. He said, well, there's this giant crane that rolls over the top of a building. The crane is so large that a person would only be half a wheel height. So I remember taking the data back to the CIA people and said, well, I was really embarrassed. I said, he's come up with this science fiction crane that's so large it rolls over the top of a building or something. And they were flabbergasted. Oh my God, that's exactly what's there. Here's the crane. It does roll over the top of a building. A person is about half a wheel height. So when they saw that, they then spent a week having him wander all through the facility, describing what was going on. And it was one of our best remote viewings we ever got. And so that really cemented in Pat Price as being an absolute spectacular remote viewer. As he wandered through the facility, he said, they're making these spheres that they put together with some kind of low thermal epoxy, and they're about 58 feet across or whatever. Well, in fact, that was a major program they had going on there. It wasn't low thermal epoxy, but they had a low temperature welding process to weld these gores together. Well, it turned out that was one of the major features of the site. So anyway, when that data was sent back to CIA to evaluate, the first group they took it to said, we're scientists. This is nonsense. There can't be anything to it. We're not going to pay any attention to this. Take it elsewhere. So, okay. They took it to a second group at CIA, and they said, we're fundamentalists. There may be something to it, but it may be demonic. We're not going to pay any attention to this. So, okay. So anyway, they took it to a third group, and they did evaluate it, and they verified much of the content, and they were very impressed. So that's really what got us into what we call operational remote viewing. Just to give you an idea of how good some of these people are, one day, Pat Price, who did several of these really excellent experiments, he came in one day and said, I got bored last night, and I was just kind of looking around the planet, and I decided to look into Nixon's Oval Office. This is during Nixon's first term, President Nixon's first term. And he said, there's a device in that office that will cause him harm, and he won't be able to get through the second term. So anyway, CIA people sent their technical people in to see if there was some toxic substance or some microwave generator or something, and they couldn't find anything. And of course, by history, we now know what it was. It was the tape recorder that did them in. But meanwhile, when we heard this, we said, oh my gosh, if Nixon doesn't last through his second term, that means Spiro Agnew will be president. And Pat Price said, nope, Spiro Agnew goes first. Well, in fact, he did, because there's some kind of money laundering scheme he was involved in. So, you want to do statistics. What's the probability of predicting that a president wouldn't last through a second term and that he would not be replaced by his VP? I mean, the odds of saying that, looking into the future even, is just astronomical. Well, he also said he was looking around the planet because he got bored again, and he found 4 UFO bases. So again, very embarrassedly, I had to contact our CIA contract monitor and say, well, we got this great remote viewer, Pat Price, but now he's telling me he found 4 UFO bases. Oh my God. But we had to report everything. And one of them, he claimed, was in Mount Seal in Australia. So our contract monitor said, well, actually, I know the station chief out in Australia. I'll call him up and see if I can find anything out, but I won't tell him why I'm calling. So he called the station chief in Australia and said, I want to ask you something about that area around Mount Seal. And the guy immediately said, oh, where the UFOs are always flying around. So who knows? So anyway, about that time, that's when the church committee, they were digging into a lot of things the CIA were doing, which were really misdeeds. Domestic surveillance of U.S. citizens, which you're not supposed to do, MK Ultra, using drugs and so on, assassination attempts and so on. So James Schlesinger took over as director of CIA for a little bit. And he said, are you guys down there in Office of Technical Services doing anything else that's squirrely? And so he said, well, we had this remote viewing program. He said, oh my God, that means people will think that we're spying on them in the bathroom. So get rid of that program. So that's how we got kicked out of CIA. But fortunately, other parts of our government were eager to take over the remote viewing program. So we began doing stuff for FTD, the Army, and so on. And eventually, we had so many people coming to us. Finally, the Defense Intelligence Agency, they said, okay, all this stuff has to be routed through us, and we'll take command of this program. So that's how we ended up with DIA being our major client. Along the way, we briefed the Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence in the Army, and he was really impressed by our remote viewing results. So he said, okay, well, we should have our own remote viewers. So we picked out 6 Army intelligence officers and volunteered them to come to SRI and see if they could do remote viewing. So anyway, we did 6 double-blind trials for each of the 6 Army officers. So we had a total of 36 trials. Typically, it turned out that this fellow was it was Joe McMonigal, who was one of the Army intelligence remote viewers. Turned out to be an excellent remote viewer. On his very first try, when he came out to SRI, the randomly chosen target was this building, and he did a really quite a nice rendition of what the target was. Long story short, in the 36 remote viewings, 6 by each of the 6 participants, you'd expect to get 6 first place matches just by chance. We got 19 first place matches by chance. So here these people who had never even heard of remote viewing did really quite well. And so Army decided to set up its own program at Army Intelligence and Security Command headquarters. So what did we learn through all this? Well, the remote viewing input seems to involve the whole person at a visceral level. It's not just primarily images that show up in people's minds. So this is very important in your training, sketching and clay modeling as opposed to simply visualizing is often the most productive. Second thing is patience is a virtue. The information comes in bits and pieces. So don't try to rush to get an interpretation of what it is you're looking at, because chances are your mind will come up with something we call analytical overlay. So think of it this way, and that is, it's sort of like you've got a door in front of you, and you drill a small hole, and you see a little bit, drill another hole, you see another bit, drill another hole, you see another bit, and eventually you've drilled enough holes that the door crumbles, and then you see the whole scene. Well, that's the way to approach remote viewing. So realize it comes in at a visceral level, so sketching and clay modeling rather than visualizing is the best way, and realize it comes in bits and pieces. And so all the training revolves around those aspects. To give an example of clay modeling, we did one with Ingo Swann where the target was a manufacturing complex at Sylvania. He did a clay model. He had a building with arches, which is probably this. He had a rounded kind of building, which is probably this. He had something going off at an angle, and there was, in fact, a building in the back that did go off at an angle just like that. And so his first drawing, we said, well, what about that sort of rounded clay model you got? And he drew it this way, as you can see that actually it's small. His drawing is labeled with rather small dimensions. And anyway, as he's drawing it, he says, you know, I get the feeling this is getting bigger and bigger, which of course, when they put it up, that is what happens. So he had to redraw it, so it's getting bigger and bigger. And the second drawing was a little more accurate, as you can see. He said, okay, fine. What about this building with arches on the left? He drew it that way. And then he said, you know, the arches aren't really sort of rounded, they're more square, which in fact they are. So he made a new drawing. By the way, he had that left-right reversal. The antenna's on the right, and he had it on the left. Anyway, we asked him, well, what are they doing inside that building? He says, well, I'll go inside and see. So he said, okay, I see this thing inside. I see gas coming into it. I see all these little jets of plasma or something. He says, I think this is like a crematorium. Well, in fact, what was inside the building was they were manufacturing high-power infrared lasers. There is gas that comes inside. The plasma discharge is segmented. So it took him to see what it actually looked like. And this is what it looks like. There's a plexiglass top, so you can see down inside with this mirror. And it does look like exactly what he described. His only comment was, how do you expect me to get this in remote viewing? I don't even know what it is when I'm looking at it. But actually his description was pretty good. So anyway, what about the science? Because for us, we were interested in the science, not so much the spy stuff. Well, it turned out about that time, the Russians had a model. They thought it was extremely low frequency electromagnetic radiation in the brainwave frequencies because it appeared difficult to shield, and that's true of low frequencies. And also the bit rate information transmission would be low, if you're sending information with these low frequencies, and that seems to match remote viewing. So he said, okay, well, that's testable. If you do experiments over long distance, they should fail if this is the model. Or if we get extremely good shielding at those frequencies, it should fail if this model is correct. And also, you would not be able to get resolution of very small devices if this model is correct, because the wavelength is so large. So he said, okay, well, let's test each of these. So in long distance series, we did a series where I went to Costa Rica, and the remote viewer was in California, describing where I am. And it turned out, just to give an example, I had a chance to do a tricky thing. I flew out of Costa Rica and landed at this airport at an island called San Andres, Colombia. And the poor remote viewer said, well, first of all, I see him in an airport. Since we're in the middle of this experimental series, I wouldn't expect to see him in an airport. Not only that, I see ocean at the end of the runway, and that can't be right because he's in San Jose, Costa Rica, and that's miles from the ocean. Let me see if I can get rid of this image and really see where he's at. Couldn't do it. So he said, okay, well, I'll just have to put down what I see, and I know I'm wrong. Well, it turned out that's exactly where I was. So this is an example that information comes in even when you think it's wrong, and it can be right. I want to give you a second example of that. We did some additional experiments, continental U.S. series. For this, my colleague Russell Targ went from city to city to city in the United States, picking out some new location. And I'd have a remote viewer in California that I was monitoring. And so here's an example from that series, which I want to show you something about. He's sitting across the table from me, and he keeps drawing and crumpling up the paper and throwing it on the floor, drawing again, throwing it on the floor. And I said, well, what are you getting? He says, what I'm getting can't be right. And but I can't get rid of this image that keeps coming into my mind. I said, well, what is it? He says, I see a giant flying saucer sitting in the middle of the city. I know that can't be right. I said, well, give me a drawing anyway. Well, it turned out where Russell was that day was the Louisiana Superdome. And so as he gave me detail, he finally realized it wasn't a flying saucer because he saw glass and so on. So this is another example that remote viewing signals can be so strong that even when the remote viewer is sure he's wrong, he may well be right. Well, the long distance series seemed to be strike one against the brainwave model. So we decided to do the second aspect, and that is, let's get good shielding. Well, it turns out that seawater is conductive, and therefore it turns out to be a good shield against brainwave frequencies. And so we got access to a small submarine. Pella Hammond was one of our first to go on the submarine, submerged in the ocean, 170 meters deep, halfway between the bottom and the top. And our contract monitor picked out what, in fact, I thought was really a stupid sight. It was just some trees up in the countryside. And so anyway, that's what she said. She says, I see a tall looming object, very tall tree, a lot of space. Gave a pretty good description. Well, it turned out that I thought this was such a lousy sight. I decided to climb around the tree to see if she might get that. And it turned out right at the very end of her remote viewing, she said, I see Hal cavorting about in the tree in a very unscientific-like fashion. And in fact, that was true. Well, we did a second experiment. For this one, Ingo Swann was the remote viewer. The site that our contract monitor picked out was this very upscale shopping center that even had foliage and water and so on inside. And he gave a description. He said he sees a lot of people walking around, red stone flooring. He hears some water. Actually, it was a pretty good description of the site. And eventually, when they were shown a series of pictures of what might have been the site, they both picked out the correct site. So that's strike two against the brainwave model, because they were deep enough into the conductive ocean that brainwave frequencies should not be able to get through the water. So we decided to go on number three, which was resolution. If there are brainwave frequencies that have very long wavelengths, you should not be able to see small objects. So anyway, instead of having outdoor scenes, we went to indoor scenes. Here's a case, Ingo, Swann, Hal Hammond. By now, they're smart enough. Neither one of them said typewriter. They just drew a picture of some keyed instrument. In this case, here's Hal Hammond on the left. That was the target. She said she sees a box with a lot of light coming out of it. Her interpretation was that it was a washing machine. So again, the washing machine aspect was an incorrect interpretation, but her description was actually quite good. Meanwhile, Fraudbuster from the CIA came back. He's really good. He gives an outline of what it looks like in there. He even tries to figure out the brand name of the teletype. He said he thought it was a Texas Instruments Silent 700. We got that wrong, but nonetheless, the description was pretty good. So then we went to the smallest of possible targets, which were microdots, a millimeter by a millimeter microdot of a large picture. And so this was really pushing the limit on size. Hal Hammond was the remote viewer for this. She said, well, she sees it's like a large, white, large area, which of course it is, and that there's machinery around, which since it's a ski resort, there is. That's a pretty good description. Another microdot in the series was a microdot of this poster. She says, I see a lot of earth colors, brown, five-pointed base. She didn't recognize it or label it as a hand, but nonetheless, she saw 5 things sticking out, which of course is correct. So this is strike 3 against the hypothesis that this was brainwave frequencies, because this is just a single millimeter by millimeter microdot of a poster and still got good results. So it's not extremely low frequency electromagnetic radiation in brainwave frequencies. We at least learned that. But what about applications of remote viewing? Well, at this time during the Carter administration, one of the missile system ideas they had was to have a shell game where you had a cluster of silos underground, all connected by a railroad, and a railroad would run around between the various silos, maybe 20 to 25 silos and so on, so that the Russians, if they wanted to take out our missiles, would have to send 25 missiles to make sure they took out all the silos, because they wouldn't know which silo the missile was in because it'd be changed on a daily basis. Well, we had one of our consultants, Charlie Tart, was doing a microcomputer study, which was a good simulation of that. He had a display of 10 possible places in the computer that have been chosen at random to be the target, but it's not displayed. And then the person sitting in front of the keyboard would have to pick out which of the 10 circles on the screen was the target. Turned out, of course, you'd expect to get 1 out of 10 by chance. Her hit rate was 1 out of 4. She did 500 trials. We did statistical averaging in a very sophisticated way and found that basically with that level of hit rate, she would be able to get 12 out of 12 hot missile silos, 100% hit rate. Probability of getting a result like that by chance is like 1 in a trillion. So that was really an excellent result. And so President Carter was briefed on that and later said that these results were one of the things that was in the back of his mind when he canceled the program. Of course, I think he had a sister who was a healer, psychic healer, and so he had some sort of sympathy for this kind of activity. Fortunately, I was able to publish in advance the results of that experiment before it got super classified. And when they finally took it to Carter, by that time it was highly classified. And anyway, he saw the results. Okay, another area that's really going to sound weird because it is. It turned out that we were also had as a client somebody in the National Security Council. And what he would do is that he would write the name of someone on a piece of paper, put it in his breast pocket in Washington, D.C., and we had a remote viewer in California who was really good, and we would say, our contact on the National Security Council has a name written on a piece of paper in his pocket in Washington, D.C. That's all I'm going to tell you. What I want is a physical description, a psychological profile, and the medical condition of the person that he's written down in his breast pocket. And generally speaking, that turned out to generate good results because they kept coming back to us for it. And typically it was like the head of state that they're trying to evaluate the medical condition of. Well, I'm going to describe to you an additional case, which was, it turns out that this was during the Carter administration. And so Iran had taken over. We had the Iran hostage case where they had several of our people in hostage. And every now and then, Ayatollah Khomeini would say he's going to release a hostage, but in fact, he didn't. So finally, we were basically paying no attention to that. Well, it turned out again, Ayatollah Khomeini says he's going to release a hostage. Well, it turned out that just on a lark, our NSC contact wrote down the name of the hostage that Khomeini said he was going to release and carried that around his pocket and said, didn't tell us that it had anything to do with the hostages, just said, again, I've written down the name of somebody. I want to get a description. So our remote viewer gave a physical description, psychological profile, and a medical condition applicable to the person written down in his pocket. And he said, actually, this guy is really sick, and yet I see him on an airplane in a few days. Well, it turned out, in this case, that the person whose name he had written down was an American hostage by the name of Richard Queen. And Khomeini was concerned because Richard Queen had MS and he was going downhill really fast. And he didn't want to have a dead hostage on his hands. So, in fact, he did release hostage Richard Queen. And so eventually, the physical description, psychological profile, and medical condition were described to Richard Queen without telling him where the information came from. And he got really irate and he said, look, if you knew that much about my condition, it must have been one of my guards gave you that information. Why didn't you get me out of there sooner? He never knew that it was a remote viewer, actually. Give you another example. A plane crashed in Africa, as it turns out, in Zaire. We had turned a Libyan pilot who was flying Russian reconnaissance aircraft. We had turned him, and he was going to fly the plane out and give it to us. Once he was in the air, however, he got cold feet and realized that probably the KGB would hunt him down the rest of his life. So he decided to just simply bail out of the plane and report that he had some malfunction in the plane. So the plane just went on until it finally ran out of fuel and crashed somewhere in Africa. Well, of course, we wanted to get the plane. Of course, the Russians wanted to get the plane. So Stan Turner at CIA, director of CIA, talked to President Carter and said, we got to find that plane. And so they decided to use remote viewers. So our contract monitor at FTD, Foreign Technology Division, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, he was a client at the time. And so he targeted 2 remote viewers, one of ours at SRI and one of his that he had at FTD. He was a good remote viewer. And long story short, they gave a description of where the plane was and what the surrounding territory looked like in terms of mountains and rivers and so on. And in fact, Rosemary Smith put an X on a map that was in 3 miles of where the plane went down. And we're talking all of Africa, thousands of square miles. But our remote viewers actually pinpointed. And so the CIA team went in and got the plane before the Russians could find it. So that was really a major positive result. We were told that would never see the light of day. It was so highly classified. But after Carter was out of office, he was giving a speech at a Georgia university, and some student asked him, well, anything happened while you're president? And it's kind of really kind of off the charts. And so he told him about this result. And so, in fact, that's how information about that got out, even though we were told it would never see the light of day. Well, Pat Price was so good at all this stuff that finally CIA hired him away from us. And so he was involved in describing interiors and locations of code rooms. And the operation officers said that he got good results. So he's definitely good to be used in operational situations. Meanwhile, the Army wasn't asleep at the switch. They were doing our counter-narcotics programs. A typical thing that would happen with them would be, it was known that there were something like 7 cargo-carrying ships coming across the ocean, and in one of the containers on one of the ships was some dope. And they wanted the Army remote viewers to tell them which ship and where was the dope. So in fact, this finally got released. And so they picked out which ship and said where the dope was. And here's a project summary that you can now find on the internet. The task would determine which of the following vessels are carrying illegal drugs. And the remote viewers said which one, and said there was white clumpy contraband in one of the corrugated containers, and located where it was. They took some action based on that, and the outcome was a strong correlation of description and location of the contraband aboard the vessel. So anyway, these are really operational, excellent results that are being generated along the way. Another operational result came from John Ingo, who was one of the Army Intelligence and Security Command, INSCOM remote viewers that came out to SRI and eventually went back to our INSCOM headquarters and worked on various remote viewings for Army intelligence. To give you one example, he was targeted on what turns out to be a shipyard in Russia, Sverdlovsk. We eventually got a picture of what that looks like. This is what it looks like if you look down inside the shipyard, and here's a drawing that Joe McMoneagle made. And he said that there was a giant submarine being built there, and that the missile tubes were in front of the sub's conning tower, which is no ship had been built like that before. And so all the submarine experts said, no, this is just all nonsense. Uh, and a ship that big, no one's building ships that big. Well, a couple months later, out comes the Typhoon submarine, which is the largest submarine ever built. And the missile doors are, in fact, exactly where he said they were. And so they checked this out after the fact and said, well, maybe we need to pay more attention to these remote viewers because this was an absolute surprise. And remote viewer Joe McMoneagle laid it all out in advance, and he was right. So that's the kind of results that are being generated in-house. Joe McMoneagle uh, got one of the highest awards that you can get doing work for Joint Chiefs of Staff, DIA, NSA, CIA, Secret Service. Excellent, excellent results. So along the way, as you can imagine, we had to brief a lot of high-level people on this stuff. And that always made me nervous because I figured, okay, we brief a high-level person, and he says this is nonsense, then that's going to kill the program because nobody below them is going to, take this seriously. And so early on, we briefed CIA Deputy Director for Science and Technology, Carl Duckett. Amazingly, he was all excited about this. And like a kid in a candy store, he made out a whole list of things he wanted our remote viewers to look at. That was really surprising. Eventually, CIA Director George H.W. Bush, Bush #1, Apollo 14 astronaut Edgar Mitchell, who was familiar with our work, told him about this program. And so he called in the contract monitor and got the program described to him. And he was amazed to hear about the results. So every year, as he was director of CIA, he got briefings on the remote viewing program. Not only that, when he went over to become vice president under Reagan, he still had yearly briefings brought to him about the remote viewing program. So we were amazed. These high-level people seem more accepting of this than you would expect. Eventually, I ended up briefing the actual CIA director, Bill Casey. We had 45 minutes with him. And once he heard the kind of results we were getting, he canceled the rest of his day. And we spent 5 hours briefing him on all the results from the remote viewing program. So this was really amazing. And so I began to develop the hypothesis, well, maybe people who make it to the top of the food chain, who are all executives, are maybe tapping into kind of an unconscious decision-making ability without realizing that they're really at some level doing remote viewing. And therefore, the people who make it to the top are people who are kind of tapping into this skill without even realizing it. Well, that was finally put to a test. A couple of researchers went to a meeting of 67 corporation presidents and asked them to participate in an experiment in which they were going to guess a 100-digit random number that was being generated the next day. And you'd expect them to get 10% by chance, and generally that's what we got. But a few people who did really well turned out to be those people whose businesses were doing really well. So in fact, that was written up in a book called Executive ESP. When these researchers talked to the ones who did really well, they said, well, do you sort of like look into the future or whatever? And they said, no, I don't believe in any of that nonsense. But I've learned that if I pay attention to my gut instinct, I'm usually right. So I think that's that happens in our lives. So the skeptics' challenge, of course, is, well, if they're so psychic, why ain't they rich? Why aren't they in the stock market? Why don't they go to Las Vegas? Well, in fact, a lot of them do, and just keep it to themselves. So I'm going to give you an example that you can use to make money if you want to. We were in the final phase, my wife was in the final phase of funding needed for a Waldorf school, an elementary school. And I went to a local dentist who I knew was wealthy and said, would you give money for our school? And he said, well, I've seen news. You had that program at SRI on ESP kind of stuff, right? And I said, yes. He said, well, tell you what, I do silver futures. So if you can get people in your program to tell me what's happening on a daily basis in the silver futures market, I will follow their lead, and I'll give you 10% of what I make for your school. And don't worry, if I lose money, I won't charge you. So they said, okay, that sounds fair enough. Well, I couldn't go to our Army intelligence remote viewers that were training and ask them to do silver futures for our school, but by now we knew the bell curve. So I said, okay. So I went to the board of directors of the school and said, okay, you all know what I do for a living, more or less. I'm going to give you a crash course in remote viewing over the weekend, and we're going to do silver futures. But we're not going to do it the way you might think. I'm not going to ask you what's happening in silver futures the next day because you might have an idea based on what you've read in the newspapers or whatever. Instead, I'm going to pick out a couple of objects. I'm going to label one of them market up. I'm going to label the other one market down. And I want you to describe to me what the object looks like that I'm going to show you the next day, which is going to be determined by the market outcome. So for example, let's say I choose a wooden figurine and a tape measure. Obviously, I pick objects that are as different as they can possibly be. So even if I get pretty poor descriptions, I should be able to tell the difference. So in fact, this was the pair of objects on a given day that I did choose for the next day's market. Of my 7 remote viewers, one of them said, I see something all wound up and I hear the words 1, 2, 3 said rhythmically. One of the other viewers said, I see a little sort of tin can and it's got something all squirreled up inside. Well, obviously, that sounds more like the tape measure than the wooden figurine, so that's what I bet on. Make a long story short, 30 days in the market, he made $260,000. We got our 10%, which was $26,000 for the school. So if you want to make money on the stock market, you can do this. Instead of getting 50-50 as you expect by chance, we ran 70-30. So it'd be 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So this actually worked. So what's the response to all of this? Well, there are those who investigate it, know it works, and those who haven't investigated and know it can't. That's basically how people respond to the idea of remote viewing. So even after the program got shut down, the Cold War ended, and so it wasn't high priority anymore. Nonetheless, people involved in the intelligence field were still very interested in it. For example, I was invited to write up the whole program for an intelligence journal in 2001, which I did. You can get copies of that paper. They're easily available. I had a fellow from the Marine Corps was doing, or from the Navy, doing a Marine Corps War College thesis, and he thought that remote viewing should be a standard facet taught to Navy SEALs. And so he did, we put him in touch with our DIA contract monitors and some of the remote viewers, and he wrote a whole thesis on this. It was very well received. Doug Morris at Department of State He also thought that this kind of thing should be integrated into our intelligence collection in general, and he wrote a thesis on it that was very well received. So interest continued beyond when the program got shut down. So what's the standard response to all of this? Well, how should we think about it? Well, actually, Congressman Charlie Rose, who's the House Permanent Select Committee Intelligence, when we briefed them, I think he said it best. He said, although I see why we must pursue this as a matter of national security, what is truly most significant about these studies is what they tell us about the human potential. And I think that really sums it up as well as can be summed up. So there we are. You've got people, scientists who check out the stars, the astrophysicists and biologists checking out living systems and so on. And then you have a few crazy physicists like myself who somehow try to look behind the scenes and see well, what's really going on and how far does it reach. And so that's what happened in our program at SRI, which I ran for 13 years. And the program continued on for another 7 under Ed May, who was my second in command. So that's my story. And if you have any questions, I'd be willing to try to answer them.